I hope everybody's doing well. Good to see everybody. Boy, do I like this Twitch better. Just so much better. And I know this mic is hot. You know, I think we talked about that before. I've got another mic over there, but I don't think either one of them. They're both USB mics. You think they could put a mute switch on that. And I'm sure there's a mute switch somewhere on this control console, which I haven't gotten to yet. But in any event, here we are. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and hit the record button on Twitch, too. So howdy, Twitch followers, YouTube followers, live followers, everybody. Just looking at the picture quality, I'm just so happy to be out of the days of Ustream. That was just brutal and unbearable. So now we've got all going, and here we are in the Stratosphere Lounge episode. I want to say 195. I think I got that too wrong, and helpful people pointed out to me that that was not the case. So anyway, it's good to be here, and I hope everybody out there is doing well. Yours truly here is working on a firewall. Needless to say, over the weekend I just crushed with all kinds of, we have real serious website problems that I have to try and deal with. But tomorrow morning I'm going to record this firewall called First Flag. I'm sure all of you have heard about this controversy. Yeah, I know it's a hot mic. Hot Mike couldn't make it today. Hot Mike couldn't be here. He, well, let's just say it was a pretty serious mani-pedi accident, and they're expected to be able to save the fingernails. They're probably going to have to amputate the feet somewhere just below the knee. This is what you get. You know, I tried to tell him, this is not the kind of thing you want to save money on, you know. But he's found some, who is he talking about with that? Somebody from, I think it was somebody from either Micronesia or Uzbekistan. It was one of those two places. And, you know, I don't know what the hell happened. In any event, he's expected to be back by tomorrow. So anyway, yeah, about the first, I'm going to call it First Flag. For those of you who haven't heard, I didn't know this movie was in production until just a short time ago. There's a movie coming out about, you know, we talk about our heroes, and what we're really talking about, I think, when we say heroes in that sense, when I say when I say, you know, Burt Rutan is a hero of mine, and Jerry Stipp is a hero of mine, and my number one hero is Neil Armstrong. Really, hero is the term we use, but what we're really talking about is role model. It's the person you want to be. It's the person whose life just inspires you to be. You want to be like them. You want to be like them. So when I heard that there was a movie, I did receive the two books. Thank you very much, Ohio Coastie. I'm sorry I didn't see that earlier. If you didn't hear about this, they've made a movie about Neil Armstrong's life called First Man, based on a book, and First Man, obviously First Man on the Moon, but he was, to me anyway, he was the first man. He was, I think I won't say that Neil Armstrong is the greatest man in history. That's certainly overstating the case, but he's the greatest man in my history. And everything that he did, I don't know if there's anybody ever more perfectly suited to their job than Neil Armstrong was suited to his job. First of all, and I'll get to the flag in a minute. First of all, in a entire occupation filled with guys who have ice water in their veins, who have nerves of steel, who you know, this is exactly the stuff that Tom Wolfe talked about with the right stuff. What is the right stuff? The right stuff is the ability to stay cool under an enormous life-threatening pressure, put away the panic, work the procedures, improvise, but don't do anything stupid. Don't improvise yourself into worse trouble, all of that stuff. So of all of the astronauts of any of the classes, including the first Mercury 7 astronauts and so on, I think most people who know anything about these guys, study the guys, because I couldn't be an astronaut, so I majored in astronaut studies. The pretty much in agreement that of all of them, Neil Armstrong was just the coolest in terms of nerves. He was on Gemini 8, I think it was. He docked with the target vehicle in Agena upper stage where they practicing the first space rendezvous and docking. He docks with the Agena. All of a sudden he gets his runaway thruster, and then next thing you know, they're rolling at something like 60 RPM, which means every second they're going around. And he was able to get that back under the control, separate from the Agena, and come back home and splash down. He flew that mission with Dave Scott, I think. And this is an interesting question. I'm just going to go to from Trevor, Trevor FL. I'm assuming it's Trevor, Florida. Are you Florida man, Trevor? Because I've heard so much about you in the news. But he asked a really interesting question, and the question is, would Neil Armstrong be remembered if he wasn't the first to walk on the moon? And the answer is he would be remembered in the same way that, Ed White is remembered, or Ken Mattingly is remembered, or Pete Conrad, or any of that. But the reason I think that's an interesting question, Trevor, is because he had to be the first man on the moon. That's what I meant when I said that Armstrong was the most perfect match for the mission. He was the most perfect. He was the perfect man to be the first man on the moon for a number of reasons. The technical reasons in terms of keeping his head under fire, being able to stay cool under pressure on Gemini 8. There's a famous story about him. If you've ever seen the lunar landing simulator, it's a jet engine surrounded by this incredibly ungainly girders and scaffolding and stuff. And basically, he's pivoting the jet engine, and he's vectoring the engine thrust the same way that the LEM was. And they didn't have computer simulators for this. So Armstrong's out there in this thing, and this thing was notoriously dangerous. It goes a little bit past, not too much past vertical, and there's no recovering, and it just flips over. But it's got a vertical jet engine, has the reaction control thrusters, and Neil was in this thing and started to get into some kind of a oscillation, and it got worse and worse and worse, and at the last second he hits the eject button. Yeah, the flying pogo stick, John Pershing says. Hits the eject button like a tenth of a second before the thing goes into the ground. Somebody timed it. It was something like that. And he parachutes down into the fireball of the wreckage of this thing. And this was an early morning test, so all of the other astronauts come into work at their regular time, or 9 or 8 or whatever it was. And this is the story I heard. And they're all being told, yeah, there was an accident, and Neil had to bail out of this vehicle. And they go, oh, man, we got to go over to the hospital to say hi. They go up to the office, and in the office is Neil Armstrong. He's changed into his short-sleeve shirt with his clip-on tie, and he's sitting there writing a report, just cool as ice. So he had the chops. A lot of people said he was the best pilot they ever saw. That he was just a great guy in terms of the flying skill. So there's that. So he was obviously qualified as a pilot. But when I say he's the only guy who could have been the first guy on the moon, there are two other things that need to be measured here. The first one sounds a little silly, but it's not. There's three other things. First of all, he was a civilian. And this is why this whole first flag thing pisses me off as much as it does. Neil Armstrong was a civilian. And this horrible, racist, homophobic, Nazi country of ours had for some reason determined that it would be an important thing that the first person to walk on the moon would be a civilian. That says a lot about this country, and I'm going to get into some more of that in a minute. So he was a civilian. That was necessary. He'd been in the Naval Reserve, but in any event, the fact that he was a civilian mattered. It was important. It wasn't Colonel Armstrong. It wasn't Commander Armstrong. It was Neil Armstrong, American citizen. The second of the three things, which is the one that sounds very trivial, is also, I think, not so trivial, and that's just the name. I mean, you almost think that you have to invent that name. But I mean, just think about it. And this is why I like talking about these things, because so many of us process this stuff and we have a reaction to it, but we're not conscious of what the reaction is. So Neil Armstrong, first of all, Armstrong. I mean, what an incredible name to have for the first guy on the moon. Armstrong, the guy with the strong arm, is a strong arm. It's a strong arm of America. It's a strong arm of humanity. Neil Armstrong is a great name. And then plus you have the Neil, which I know is not spelled the same way, but when you put them together, Neil Armstrong, it's basically saying be humble, Hercules, be humble, strong. Neil Armstrong, and you can't invent a name like that, and he happened to have it. But of all the things that Neil Armstrong had that made him the only guy who I think was really ever the perfect guy to be on the first guy on the moon was his personality. And I was talking to my beautiful wife, Natasha, about this. Hey, honey, I'll be home soon. And I said, in my opinion, there were only two people in the space programs of their respective countries that encapsulated their countries, encapsulated them. And I think the only two genuine celebrities in terms of historical qualities in the space program were Neil Armstrong as the archetypical American and Yuri Gagarin as the absolute typical Russian. Gagarin, by all accounts, was an incredibly charismatic, nice, friendly, humble guy. And he was Russian-looking, and he landed in this field. He ejected from his craft. That was the design that was going to get him out. They couldn't be sure they get the Vostok capsule down soft enough, so they built it so he ejected from the capsule. Technically, that violated the actual record, but nobody gave a damn about that. It's just childishness. But in any event, Gagarin ejects from Vostok 1 at low altitude, parachutes down to the ground. He, in the middle of this field out in the steppes someplace, this Russian babushka comes up to him, and and she says, "What planet are you from?" And he says, "I'm from Russia." And there's a really amazing story, and that is this. There was, somebody's going to tell me exactly what this was in a minute. So they flew the Vostok missions. Gagarin becomes a national hero, and rightfully so. He's just perfect. He's just absolutely perfect. And he's charming and friendly, and he's charismatic, and he's, what's the word I'm looking for when you're good on camera? Photogenic. So the Soviets are off to a pretty big lead. First satellite, the first orbit, the first man in space, all of this. And then they're working on their next capsule, which might have been Vostok, I think. Vostok was the first one. Vostok, I think, was between Vostok and Soyuz. And that second capsule was a piece of junk, and everybody knew it. And the same thing with the Apollo 1 capsule command module. They knew that was junk too, but they were in a hurry. So the pilot of that capsule, I want to say, was Komenev. Something like that, I think. In any event, he knew that this capsule was a death trap, and he basically said, "I'm not flying it," which is an act of moral and mortal courage in the Soviet Union. You're in the cosmonaut program. You say you're not going to fly this thing. Not flying it. It's not safe. It's a death trap. And they said, "Okay, well, if you're not going to fly it, then the backup Kamenev, I think. So if you're not going to fly it, that's fine. We'll give it to the backup pilot. And the backup pilot for that mission is Yuri Gagarin. And this guy was Gagarin's best friend. And he knew how important Gagarin was to the Russian people. And he knew how irreplaceable Gagarin was. And he was sure that if he'd flown that mission, he was going to die in that capsule. And if he refused, then Gagarin would die in the capsule. So he decided he was going to fly the mission. So he did. And he kept Gagarin on the ground. And he burned up on reentry. And there is a radio transmission, which I've heard, of him screaming, yelling, not screaming in pain, yelling, screaming in rage at the ground controllers for having put him in this death trap. He's literally cursing them as his spaceship's coming apart. And there's a pretty awful picture. I'm not recommending anybody looks for it or anything, but there's a picture of what remains of him, and it's the whole body is, this big probably, and it's like in a plexiglass case, and there are these other Russian officers looking at this piece of thing that was him, and would have been Gagarin. But Gagarin, to me, represented Russia at its absolute best. He was like the all-American Russian boy. And Neil Armstrong had that quality. Neil Armstrong needed to be the first man on the moon because of his personality as well as his flying skills, in my opinion. Armstrong was very quiet. He was exceedingly humble, I think. He certainly behaved that way. When you're the first man on the moon and you get out of the Apollo program and you're a private citizen, there are some financial opportunities available to you for endorsements. And I seem to recall he only did one. I remember Neil Armstrong did a Timex watch commercial, or what, Timex or Rolex? One commercial years after the moon landing. And then he landed on the moon, became the most famous man in the world, and then he just disappeared. He just stepped away, like Cincinnatus. He went on to he went back, I guess, to teach engineering. I want to say it was at Purdue. And he was always there teaching engineering in this relatively obscure school, and you never saw him. You never saw him on The Tonight Show. You never saw him he's never on The Dating Game. He was never on Hollywood Squares. He was just Neil. And I have a lot of respect for Buzz Aldrin, enormous respect for Buzz Aldrin, but to be honest with you, I mean, you could probably get Buzz to open a 7-Eleven. But Armstrong was very private and very quiet and very, very American and American-looking. And he was made for it. That was what he was built for, was to be the first man on the moon. And to be the guy who became the first man on the moon as well. The actual mission went a lot more rocky than most people believed. It's an interesting term, rocky, because the computers, the radar, the computers that are bringing the LEM down. I've followed the entire landing sequence of all of the Apollo missions available online. I watched from about 15 minutes until landing. I've watched them all in real time. I watched Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And they're all the same procedures at the same time. 12 is especially funny because Conrad and Al Bean was just such an enthusiastic guy. Bean's going, yeah, baby, plenty of fuel, man, plenty of fuel, baby. You're looking great, baby. It's fun to listen to. When they made From the Earth to the Moon, they cast that guy from, was it from Kids in the Hall? As Alan Bean. Anyway, so on the Apollo 11 mission, they're coming down. They're basically, for most of the descent, the engine is pointing forwards. They're looking pretty much up at the sky. They can't really see much of anything because they need to slow down. They need to slow their trajectory down as they do. And then as they finally get to a point where they get slow enough, then there's an event that happens. Is it P61, 62, something like that? It's an event in the computer program, Dave Foley, yeah. And then all of a sudden the LEM pitches almost completely upright, and now for the final ending of the landing, it goes down more or less vertically, and so there comes this moment when all of a sudden you can see things you couldn't see much before, but now you can. Now you're vertical. Now you look out there, and you've been following this computer down, and you're already very concerned because you're looking at this. Your entire life depends on this ground radar. This radar is what's telling you how high you are above the lunar surface, and this is the one that you have to have. And as Neil and Buzz are coming down, all of a sudden they get this warning signal. You get an error code on the computer nobody's ever seen before, and it's like it's the radar, the ground radar. We don't know how high we are above the surface of the moon, and all of our fuel calculations and everything else are going to be based on this. We lost our radar. Was it 1201? I think 1201 error or something. It sounds about right. So they're saying, what's the 1201? And Mission Control says, stand by, Neil. And so they're on their way down. Their rocket's burning, and they're on their way down, 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 down. And then they find out it's probably just an overload. They tell them to ignore it. 1202. Thanks, Martin. And so they're on their way down, and they're looking at their instrumentation, and they're trying to land this thing. And again, 1202. They're this is it. And there's a lot of people who've said that, given the fact that you had the 1202s, and also the fact that they were so low on fuel relative to later missions, that there's a lot of people that have said he really should have aborted or whatever, but nobody was going to, he wasn't going to abort that. Nobody was going to abort that landing. When you listen to these guys, and you listen to it in real time, and I can hopefully chuck a link up to it, but just look for Apollo 11 landing inside the LEM, and it's really quite incredible. Still picture looking out the outside of Aldrin's window, but all the radio is there. So they pitch over, and they're coming down. They've got this terrible concern about not knowing what their true altitude is, which figures into all of these calculations. And as they're watching themselves come down, the autopilot is taking them straight smack into the middle of this field of boulders about the size of houses. If memory serves, the LEM could land on an incline of up to 12 degrees, maybe 12, 15 degrees tops, and it's that much. Any more than that, the ship was really in trouble. And needless to say, you land on a rock, the thing tips over, and it either explodes or you're not getting off the moon, because that second stage has to go up. I was right, 1201, 1202. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So they're on their way down, and Neil sees that, okay, here we are. We've come all this way. We've waited all this time, flown all these missions. We flew Apollo 7. We tested the command module in orbit. Then we flew Apollo 8. We tested the command service module around the moon and back. Then we flew Apollo 9, which we tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Then we flew Apollo 10, which was a dress rehearsal. The LEM goes down. I forget how low they got, but I don't know. It must have been heartbreaking for, was it Young, I guess, on Apollo 10? Or Cernan, one of those two. Anyway, we're going to leave. We go down, but we're not going to land, and we go back up again. So they did all of this stuff to get there. And finally, he's about to land this thing, and the autopilot's going to take him right into this boulder field. So Neil Armstrong just says, okay, I got it, my airplane, basically. And he decides that he's going to increase the throttle, which means that we're going to, if we're on a trajectory that's going to land us, like this, by increasing the throttle, he's basically making himself go further downrange. He's going to overfly the boulder field, and then he's going to land. But there was not a lot of reserve fuel to begin with. This is the first time they'd ever done it. They hadn't learned anything from the landings because they hadn't done any landings before. So he's going to land long, and he just takes over the vehicle. And there's a 60-second fuel warning, and that 60-second warning goes off, and then he just takes it down and lands it. And Buzz is calling off the forward motion and stuff, and I don't remember if it was 11 or 12. Maybe it wasn't 11. Somebody kept saying, bring her down, bring her down. It was one of those missions. So they land, and I don't know what they had fuel left. I want to say it was 15, 20 seconds of fuel, something like that. And somebody here is going to know the answer to this. The first word from the moon is, I think the first word from the moon, people say it's Houston. That's the first word broadcast from the moon. The first word spoken from the surface of the moon on the radio is Houston. Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. But the first words actually said, I think, was master. It's like master switch off. Contact light probably happened just before they were on the moon. They had the long probes coming out of the bottom of the LEM, and the second that one of these probes, they're pretty decent size, 5-6 feet long. The second one of these probes touch the lunar surface, they get a contact light, and then they simply turn off the engines. And one of the missions, 12, I think it was, 12 or 14, they cut the engine and the thing just goes karump. It really it drops. So, contact light, and they're down. And then the first word, I think, spoken on the surface of the moon is master. It says master switch off or something like that. Or is it okay, engine stop? it's basically a series of 5 or 6 things on the checklist. So basically, he's making the vehicle safe. We're on the moon, yes, okay. Master switch off, engine safety on. There's a couple of these other things, and then they're there. Then they make the transmission rather. Apparently, Neil and Buzz, when they were on the moon, when they made it, before they gave the Tranquility base call, they just looked at each other for a second or two, just looked at each other and smiled. These are not emotional people. They're not. They're not dynamic people in conversations. They're not very talkative. Master control arm off. Thank you, Dave Big Booty. The first word from the spoken on the moon was master. Master control arm off. That's right. So they're making the engine safe. So then he makes the transmission. Now, all of this is happening in real time, and we don't know the outcome of what's going to happen, as we do now, talking about it in retrospect. Who was it who pointed it out earlier? Was it Vresic? Yeah. You can hear Armstrong. The only time you ever hear Armstrong, he's not panicked, but he wants an answer. He's flying this thing down to a landing, which he can't really do without the radar altimeter. And he's already told Mission Control we have a 1202. And Mission Control's not answering because they don't know what the hell the 1202 is. They have to start talking to the telemetry guys and the guys working in Mission Control. And Armstrong, meanwhile, while this is going on, a second delay away, by the way, Armstrong's about to land this thing in the middle of the frickin' moon, and he doesn't know what this error is. So Armstrong, Vresic got it exactly. You can hear it's a little note of urgency. It's like it's a 1202. What is that? Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm. In other words, what the hell is going on? Is this something that we can survive or not? And they basically said, yeah, it's an instrumentation issue. Reset it and ignore it, and you're still go. Anyway, that's the story of the landing of Apollo 11. Let me tell you why this thing with the flag thing pisses me off so very much. So they land on the moon. There was talk about them having get a sleep before that happened, but nobody thought that was good. I mean, there was a sleep period built in there, but there's no way they were going to go sleep, and they knew it. Everybody knew it. So they go out on the moon. And Neil comes down, and he says that, by the way, this is important. He lands on the moon, and Neil Armstrong says, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Everybody printed it as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That doesn't make any sense. People thought that Neil botched it, that he somehow botched the lines, which he wrote. It wasn't given to him. That was Neil. They said, Neil, whatever you want to say, that's your business, whatever you want to say. And so Neil Armstrong chose to say, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, which was repeatedly printed as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and that doesn't make any sense. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Man and mankind are the same things. One small step for a man, me. One giant leap for mankind, all of us. And they know that he actually said amen because they recently took a look at the radio transmissions and they were able to figure out there was a radio anodyne going on there. Something was happening where the radio was two people were trying to speak at the same time or something like that. But he does say a man, but you have to listen to it because if you just hear it, it sounds like one small step for a man. Anyway, what did he say? What did he say when he stood on the moon? Did he recite the Pledge of Allegiance? And then after that, Buzz comes down, and I don't think any of us can forget the moment when Neil and Buzz on the surface of the moon plant the giant foam finger that says USA on one side and we're number one on the other. And then they basically started leaning into the camera saying, USA, 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 we're number one, we're number one. That's what they did when they landed on the moon. The entire reason that this flag thing pisses me off so much is because of the graciousness that the Americans used when we went to the moon. The graciousness of it. The lack of this jingoistic, kind of thing that they're accusing us of. They think, patriots, patriots are those people who live in trailer parks who wear red, white, and blue, top hats and go to Tea Party rallies. That's what patriots are. That's what Hollywood thinks. But we had a chance to say whatever the hell we wanted to when we first landed on the moon. And we said, the first thing we say on the moon is, it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And we put a plaque there too, by the way. There's a plaque on the base of the lunar module for Apollo 11. It's still there. It'll be there forever. And I don't need to look it up. I don't need to remember it. I know exactly what was written on it. It was a plaque that said, "Here men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 20th, 1969, we came in peace for all mankind." So when they say that we're not going to show the flag planting, it's because they're ashamed of it. And they don't show the planting because it's embarrassing to them. It's embarrassing to the director. It's embarrassing to the producers. This whole patriot thing is very embarrassing to them. And while while taking the actual planting of the flag out of the movie pissed me off, the thing that pissed me off more than this, and that's quite a good bit, was when the director got on, I think it was on Hannity, and basically said, Ryan Gosling, of course, broke the ice on this, and when they got a 3-minute ovation in Venice, I guess it was. But Ryan Gosling said, "Yeah, we chose to look at this as more of a collective achievement of humanity." Well, it wasn't a collective achievement of humanity. So in return for America being as gracious as it was, "Here men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 20th, 1969. We came in peace for all mankind." America's not mentioned in there. United States isn't mentioned in there. Nothing's mentioned in there. His first words from the moon have nothing to do with America. Nothing. The whole thing was treated, by the way, if you look at the mission patches for every American space mission, I do not think there's an exception to this. They have the name of the mission. They often have some kind of representation of some kind of cool image, and they have the names of the people on the crew. Apollo 8, there's like a figure 8, and it's Borman, Lovell, and Anders. And Apollo 17 is Cernan, Schmidt, and I've forgotten who. Conrad, Gordon, and Bean, and Shepard, Russa, and Mitchell. And all the guys' names and all the shuttle missions, every single one of them, they got the names of the people on the mission. But Apollo 11 doesn't. Apollo 11 doesn't. Apollo 11 is a picture of an American eagle landing on the moon, and in its talons are not arrows, and it's not the American flag, and it's not the Statue of Liberty, and it's not a corn dog, and it's not, a gun, and all the rest of the stuff that these Hollywood elite bastards think that patriotism is. The mission badge for Apollo 11 is an American eagle landing on the moon with a laurel wreath like an olive branch in its talons. It's landing. It's literally landing peace on the moon. It's bringing the symbol of peace that has been throughout history in its clutches to land on the moon. We're landing here in peace. There's no America. There's no red, white, and blue. There's no flag. Nothing on all of this. And I had always thought that was such a gracious thing for America to do. That it was such a gracious thing that all of this, the badges, the iconography, the first words, the plaque, all of it is about humanity and so on and so on and so on, and not a weird number one, which we had every goddamn right on the planet to be doing. But no. So now we can't show the planting of the flag, and the reason we're told that they can't show the flag planting, which apparently was shot but cut out of the movie, the reason we're told is because it'll anger the Chinese. Oh, is that the reason? First of all, I don't believe that's the reason, but let's just assume that it is the reason that they say it is. We don't want to show them planting the American flag because it'll anger the Chinese. There's a lot to be said about this. First of all, not showing the planting of the flag on the moon Showing the planting of the flag on the moon is going to anger the Chinese, but not showing it's going to anger the Americans, but they don't care about that. So why would they care about what America thinks when there's always Chinese to worry about? And if that announcement is in fact true, then basically what they're saying is the only thing that we care about in the world is box office. And that's not a big surprise to me or anything, but nevertheless, they're saying, so if we end up pissing off all of America and insulting the entire American people, we'll do that because the Chinese market is bigger? Is that it? That's number one. Number two, while we were landing on the moon and talking about coming in peace for all mankind and all the rest of it, the People's Republic of China was continuing their process of exterminating their own people. The Communist Party that was in power during the moon landing is the Communist Party that's in power today when these Hollywood bastards want to send a movie to China and have great box office. The Chinese are still run by the Communist Party, and that party killed 50 million people right around the time that Neil was training for this mission. While America was training for this mission and while we were ready to go to the moon and come in peace for all mankind, the Chinese communists were killing millions, tens of millions of their own people for this murderous ideology, which is still the ideology that is running China. And these assholes in Hollywood have decided that they would rather make those people happy than the people that actually went to the moon and came in peace for all mankind. That's where their priorities are. That's where their priorities are. And when you get right down to it, you will find that it is not, I don't believe that's the reason. They're embarrassed. They're embarrassed of it. The director of this movie is a Canadian. Okay, that's fine, you know. By the way, in this firewall, I'm going to go a little bit further. I'm going to point out a couple things. I can show it here, but it won't show up on YouTube. I'll just save it for tomorrow for the firewall.